Welcome back to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is the fifth Thursday of July, and we are joining you today, July 29th, 2021, streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey, and along with me is co-host John SAKOWICZ.
Good to be with you again, Mary, in the second half an hour of the show. Just great stuff with Richard Silverstein talking about the NSSO group in Israel and Israel's cyber mercenary for hire industry. Just fascinating stuff and pretty scary stuff. We welcome Professor Chomsky to the show for the first time, so I'll let you take it away with the introduction.
Before I do that, I want to say that all of our programs are going to be archived here at kmud.org and at our show website, heroespatriots.org. You can give us a call at 707-923-3911. We'll take as many calls as possible. So we are beginning our second half hour of the program, and we welcome first-time guest, Aviva Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is an American teacher, historian, author, and activist. She is a professor of history and the coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem State University, Salem, Mass. She previously taught at Bates College in Maine and was a research associate at Harvard. We're going to talk about her new book, but specifically what President Biden is about with respect to immigration. Her new book, I might mention, is one of many. It's called Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration. So with that having been said, let's welcome Professor Chomsky. Professor, are you with us?
I am with you.
Well, welcome first to the program. We're delighted that you're able to join us, and we want to get right down to it with this brief 30 minutes with you. Talk about first of all, your new book and briefly what it's about, and then let's jump into 2021 and what President Biden is up to.
Sure. So I started writing the book after kind of coming to realize. So I've written a lot about immigration and, of course, about Central American migration. My initial foray into history was through Central American history. It was in the 1980s when I started graduate school, in part deciding to go to graduate school in history because of being aware of the wars in Central America, the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979, the ongoing wars in El Salvador and Guatemala, and the influx of refugees into the Bay Area of California. I was a student at UC Berkeley. So it was my sort of interest in current events in the 1980s and, of course, the increasing U.S. involvement in the region under Ronald Reagan. So that's what got me interested in history and in Latin American history specifically, and I've always taught a course on Central America. Of course, Central American refugees continue to come into the United States many decades after the wars, and I've also done a lot of writing about that. But as I teach my Latin American history, and especially my Central American history course, I have been really struck at how those years of the 1980s have kind of gone down a memory hole. So my students, I have a lot of students who are Central American. They don't know anything about those years. Many of their parents or grandparents were war refugees, but they've never talked to their children about it. And, of course, my U.S. American students also, they never got there in high school, in their high school history classes. So for those of us who lived through those years, I think the power and the drama is so huge, and its reverberations today are so visible, and yet the people who are living it today don't remember.
Could you briefly reflect on how the United States has had a role in immigration and the influx of immigrants and so forth through the years? I mean, it seems like we've had our finger in that pie for some time and have had a role in poverty and so forth. Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, so Central American immigration to the United States was extremely small scale before the 1980s. And there was, of course, a very large Mexican immigration to the United States, and the integration of the U.S. southern and western economies with the Mexican economy and the dependence of the United States on Mexican migrant labor has a very long history. Now, the United States also has a very long history of intervention in Central America, but it's not until the 1980s that we start seeing migration specifically as a result of this long-term intervention. Poverty and violence, yes, but until the wars and revolutions of the 1980s are crushed by the United States, we don't have the large-scale flight from Central America that we're seeing now. But I would say that U.S. policy towards Central America ever since the mid-1800s has been one of promoting a very particular economic model in Central America, a model of openness to foreign investment, welcoming to foreign investment, and the idea that so-called economic growth or economic development based on foreign investment is going to be beneficial to the people of Central America. We've been proven wrong over and over and over again, but since the 19th century, the United States was promoting coffee export economy, banana export economy, lots of profits for U.S. corporations, lots of displacement and forced labor for Central American populations. After World War II, it's the development decades of the 20th century when the United States is pouring resources into promoting foreign investment in new export activities. After World War II, it's in particular the development of cotton plantations, a cattle industry. This model is kind of thrown into turmoil in the 1980s with huge popular rebellions against the dispossession and poverty that it's causing for their populations. But after the peace treaties of the 1990s, we have what we often call the neoliberal era that brings back this model full force. That is what Central American governments need to do, says the United States, and forces the United States upon them, is to create the ideal environment for foreign investors. And that means low taxes, it means no regulations, no environmental regulation, no protections for workers, and it means a heavy dose of militarization to crush and put down any attempts by peasants and workers to change their reality and to get for themselves more of a share of their country's wealth.
It's points all very well taken, and I thank you for mentioning what the unintended consequences of the 2005 Central America Free Trade Agreement were. It seems that, that would be intended to support, free trade types of farmers, but in fact it has just the opposite effect. If you will, Professor, you've talked about how our policies contribute, and if not, they're the outright causes of poverty and violence in Central America. But talk about public corruption as well. We support puppet governments. We support failed dictators. We support a corrupt military. Just speak on that issue for a moment, if you will.
Okay, but let me just qualify one thing that you said about unintended results of the Central America Free Trade Agreement. I would say the results that the Central America Free Trade Agreement of 2005 have had were completely intended.
Wow.
That is the
point well taken.
The goal of the Central America Free Trade Agreement was to promote U.S. agribusiness and U.S. foreign investors at the expense of Central American small farmers, and that's exactly what it did.
Point well taken.
You wanted to talk about corruption.
Yes.
So, I mentioned earlier the U.S. history of political meddling political intervention, economic intervention, military interventions into Central America. I can point to the 1954 invasion of Guatemala that overthrew a democratically elected government. Their attempts in Nicaragua during the entire decade of the 1980s to overthrow the democratically elected government in Nicaragua. Their most recent overthrow or support for the overthrow of a democratically elected government in Honduras in 2009. So it's not just that the United States has supported, it's actually imposed undemocratic and corrupt leaders as long as they're willing to serve the interests of the United States, which are basically the interests of foreign corporations and this economic model that I've been talking about that the United States insists upon for Central America. And it's been quite a pattern, too, that the political leaders they decide to overthrow are those who are actually trying to grant rights to workers, grant rights to peasants, put into place land reforms, redistribute the wealth of the country. It's a very clear pattern. So those kinds of governments that actually try to develop accountability to their populations, the United States does not like those. It overthrows them. Wow. And it's the corrupt elite and foreign corporation allies that the United States imposes and supports. And just in terms of corruption and impunity, I should also mention that in the peace treaties that were signed in El Salvador in 1992 and Guatemala in 1996, in both of those cases, the UN came in with a truth commission to investigate war crimes that had been committed overwhelmingly by the U.S.-supported governments of these two countries in their wars against the population, which in Guatemala reached the extent that the UN defined it as a genocide against the population. These were governments supported by the United States. But the truth commissions had a very limited mandate. That is, they wanted to uncover crimes committed by Central American actors. They never looked at all at the U.S. role. So I think the climate of corruption and impunity that the United States has fostered in Central America, I think the peace treaties and the way that the truth commissions basically exonerated the United States has been a big factor in the climate of corruption and impunity that has persisted since then.
And would it be also true that this model of exploitation could not work unless there were power elites in these Central American countries as well, who were benefiting from this?
That is, the United States has found ready and willing allies amongst the Central American elites, and even before the United States started to get involved, which is in the middle of the 19th century. Central America has been, it was colonized by the Spaniards, and a Euro-descended, both Spanish and from other parts of Europe and even the Ottoman Empire, elites have controlled the vast majority of the land and resources, and those have been the natural allies of the United States in trying to maintain a system that privileges the few at the expense of the many.
Right. Where do we go on immigration reform? We have Vice President Harris in Central America declaring quite arrogantly, quote unquote, don't come to the United States, stay where you are. Where do we go with immigration reform?
So I think that that the immigration reform is such a has been turned into such a politicized and hot button issue in the United States, kind of like vaccines, that it's almost impossible to talk about rationally. It's almost impossible for anybody who supports a truly humanitarian immigration reform to even have their voices heard. But I would actually argue that the creation of the U.S.-Mexico border and the decision, which is actually a very recent decision, it goes back to 1965, that immigration from Mexico and Central America should be restricted, that people should be prevented from coming from Mexico and Central America to the United States, has always, our immigration system has always been a racist and exclusionary system. The creation of the border was a racist project to try to give privileges to some while discriminating against others, and that our current global system of borders and walls is a system of global apartheid. It's a system of trying to preserve privilege for the few, primarily European and white, and to lock people of color who have been colonized out of the benefits that Europe and the United States have created for their own citizens based on the colonial exploitation of the Third World. So a truly just immigration reform would not restrict immigration at all. That is, it would recognize that immigrant rights are human rights and that the right to migrate is a human right. With particular respect to Central America, it would recognize that immigration, that Central Americans have tried, the Central American poor have tried for decades to change the systems in their own countries so that they could survive at home. And every single time the United States has intervened to crush that. And, you know, I've just mentioned a couple of the examples, like in Guatemala in 1954, like in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala in the 1980s. Like in Honduras in the 21st century. Migration is a way that the Central American poor are trying to survive and improve the situation that has been imposed on their countries by the United States. So I think we should see migration as a solution rather than as a problem.
Right.
It's 46 minutes past the hour. If you've just tuned in, this is Heroes and Patriots, and our guest this morning is Professor Aviva Chomsky. We're talking about the Biden administration's immigration plan. Let's look specifically at that. He calls it a plan for security and prosperity. What is your feeling about those words?
Well, those are very loaded words when it comes to a Central American perspective, and if you look at the content of his plan, you can see that Central Americans' reservations about those words are very justified. Because when he talks about security, what he really means is militarization, and in particular, anti-migrant militarization. That is not just the militarization of the U.S. southern border to try to put into practice what Kamala Harris was advising, do not come, but the militarization of Mexico's southern border and Guatemala's southern border, that is to outsource U.S. immigration policy to the borders and to the interiors. So they want Mexican, Guatemalan police to basically enforce U.S. border policy, U.S. immigration policy on their own borders and inside their own countries. Now,
I was about to get to that. The dirty little secret of immigration enforcement is the fact that we've outsourced a lot of border control to Mexico to guard its southern borders. And I don't think the press really has focused on that.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. Who is covering this?
Who's covering this?
And what American citizens just think that immigrants are taking their job, which you have a book about, 20 Other Myths, which I hope we can talk about. But this is just so not known by the average American citizen.
It's just so dirty and filthy and repugnant to me that America would outsource border control to our southern neighbors, Mexico and Guatemala, effectively saying to the poor, those seeking asylum here in the United States from Central America, again, don't come, stay where you are.
And talk about the other word, prosperity. I think that is, as you say, is loaded.
Yes, the term prosperity is absolutely loaded, and that has to do with the history of the kinds of economic policies the United States has pushed on Central America, including with the Central America Free Trade Agreement. That is, in its conception of prosperity, prosperity is going to come through foreign investment. Now, foreign investors are looking for things like low taxes, cheap labor, no environmental regulation, and a high degree of security, that is militarization, to prevent unions from forming, to prevent workers and peasants from defending their lands, from defending their rights. So prosperity, the theory, it's kind of like the Ronald Reagan theory of trickle-down growth. If we give corporations everything they want, then they'll invest, and that will trickle down to the population. But really, Democrats and Republicans, and including our current president, Joe Biden, are imposing that kind of trickle-down theory on Central America, and that's exactly what he means by prosperity.
Listen, it's 49 minutes past the hour. Professor, we have a caller. If you're listening, please go ahead with your question.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for this astute analysis. I'm wondering if you could extend it to the role of foreign aid as well, because I'd love to hear your views on the historical and current issues associated with foreign aid as a way of reinforcing or maybe reinforcing the damage that's being caused by the investment policies trickle down, or not. And in that light, the role of local groups, especially the women's groups that are very strong in Central America, that may be countering some of the adverse effects.
So most of U.S. foreign aid comes through programs like the U.S. Agency for International Development, or the National Endowment for Democracy. And if you look at close studies of what happens to that aid, a good part of it actually ends up right back in the pockets of U.S. corporations, because it's aid with strings attached, and those strings often require that it be used to purchase U.S.-made machinery, U.S. agricultural products, U.S.-made pesticides and fertilizers, or that it be used to construct infrastructure like roads, bridges, electrical systems for U.S. corporations. Maquiladora industries are one of the big ones right now. That is export processing plants where U.S. companies outsource back to that, the labor-intensive portion of their production to places like Central America. And I urge everybody to check out the tags on your clothes, because probably 3/4 of the people listening to this have at least one item of clothing that's going to say made in El Salvador, made in Honduras, made in Guatemala, made in Nicaragua. That's an example of the maquiladora industry. So U.S. government foreign aid generally does not do a lot to help the poor. There may be a little project here and there that builds a well or provides something. But in terms of the larger economic impact, and I think it's worth noting that Biden's plan promises $4 billion over the course of 4 years for Central America. And when Vice President Harris was most recently in Guatemala, she came with a promise of several $100 million. But that promise had a condition, and the condition was that Guatemala agree to have U.S. Department of Homeland Security personnel operating on Guatemala's southern border. And when the United States a few weeks before that, when Biden promised a vaccine delivery to Mexico, obviously vaccines are something that Central American countries and Mexico desperately need, but they don't need them with strings attached. And Biden's offer of vaccines to Mexico also came with strings attached in terms of Mexico's agreement to enforce, basically, U.S. border policy.
And this all has a history, and it has a surprising history. Our anti-immigration bias here is not something that was new to Trump. Actually, the groundwork for it was laid by Clinton and Obama. And that first came to my attention in reading your book, Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal. Just go into a brief history of this bias.
So, U.S. bias or discrimination against workers of color actually, of course, goes all the way back to before even the founding of the United States. Of course, the United States was founded on the idea that it was a white men's country and that people of color were welcome, not only welcome, but kidnapped and forced to come to work for white men, but that they were not considered to be citizens or people who belonged to the country. Native Americans were to be expelled. African Americans were to be enslaved. So after the United States becomes the United States and, of course, maintains those policies of native expulsion and and restriction of citizenship to white people and enslavement of people of African descent, new sources of workers of color, especially from Mexico and China, as the conquest of the continent continues over the course of the 19th century, and especially after slavery is abolished in mid-late 19th century, new sources of workers of color who the United States fully intends to deny citizenship. So the bias is there from the very beginning of U.S. immigration law. Immigration is restricted to free white persons who are allowed to become citizens. Everyone else is welcome to work, but not to become a citizen, not to truly be considered an immigrant.
Wow.
We are almost out of time. We are almost out of time, Professor. I was wondering if you could, in both in English and in Espanol, to our Spanish-speaking listeners, if you could just give maybe a 1-minute summary of some of the resources out there for immigration reform.
Hay muchísimas organizaciones que trabajan a favor de los derechos de los inmigrantes. Realmente la posibilidad de una reforma migratoria ahora me parece muy lejos, pero siento que nos vale más ahora luchar para los derechos de los inmigrantes que en el Congreso específicamente. I was saying that I feel like the possibility for a truly just immigration reform is very remote right now. There are many organizations around the country fighting for immigrants' rights, and I feel like our energies are probably better spent now working directly with these organizations, immigrant rights organizations, than trying to lobby Congress for an immigration reform that I just don't think is in the cards.
Right.
Professor, our next show next Thursday will be focusing on Cuba and the pink tides in Latin America, the new socialist tides in Latin America. We have a wonderful guest, Carlos Garrido, and we hope you'll be listening, and we hope you can join the discussion.